Judge Eleanor Washington, 78, grips her steering wheel as blood trickles down her temple from the gash officer, Blake Miller's baton left moments ago. She watches through her cracked windshield as he radios dispatch, unaware of who she really is. Pain pulses through her wrists where the handcuffs cut into her dark skin. This routine traffic stop in Bakersfield that spiraled into violence would shatter more than her car window. It would crack open decades of systemic injustice in the Randall County Police Department. No one yet realizes the storm coming. Will justice finally be served when the scales are so heavily weighted against her? Before we begin this shocking true story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. If you believe in equal justice under law, regardless of race or age, hit that like button and subscribe, because tomorrow's special episode reveals what happens when those sworn to uphold the law become the very ones breaking it. Eleanor Washington's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her rearview mirror, the familiar road back from Oakwood Cemetery bringing both comfort and pain. Today marked 47 years since she'd married Thomas, and 23 years since she'd buried him. The fresh roses she'd placed on his grave seemed to linger in her mind as she drove her modest Lincoln sedan through the suburbs of Bakersfield. At 78, Eleanor carried herself with the dignified bearing of someone who had witnessed history unfold before her eyes. Born in segregated Mississippi, she had marched alongside civil rights leaders, fought for equality in courtrooms when female attorneys were rarities, and eventually risen to become the first black female judge in her district. Her recent appointment to the Supreme Court had been the culmination of a lifetime battling injustice. The flashing red and blue lights in her mirror startled her from her reminiscing. Eleanor checked her speedometer. She was driving exactly at the limit. She signaled and pulled over carefully, mentally reviewing the last few minutes of her drive. She hadn't run any lights or stop signs. Her registration and insurance were current. Eleanor lowered her window and placed both hands on the steering wheel, the lessons of a lifetime of being black in America never far from her mind. Even at her station, Officer Blake Miller approached with his hand resting on his holster, mirrored sunglasses hiding his eyes, despite the evening hour. He was young, maybe 30, with closely cropped blonde hair and the overly developed physique of someone who spent too many hours at the gym. "License and registration, Grandma," he barked without preamble. Eleanor maintained her composure. "Good evening, officer. May I ask why I've been stopped?" Miller's mouth tightened. "I said license and registration. Now, I'm happy to provide." But I'd like to know the reason for the stop, please," Eleanor replied, her tone measured but firm. "You ran that stop sign back there," Miller snapped. "Playing dumb won't help you." Eleanor knew with absolute certainty she hadn't run any stop sign. "Officer, I respectfully disagree. I came to a complete stop at every intersection." Miller's face flushed. "Are you calling me a liar? Step out of the vehicle." "I don't believe that's necessary for a routine traffic stop," Eleanor said calmly. "If you'd like to see my license, I'll provide it." She reached slowly for her purse. "Set out of the car," Miller shouted, suddenly yanking her door open. "You people always think you know better than officers of the law." Eleanor felt a chill at the phrase "you people," but maintained her dignity. "Officer, I have arthritis and getting out will take me a moment. I'm also a federal judge and I—" Miller's laugh cut her off. "Yeah, right. And I'm the president. Out, now." With painful slowness, Eleanor eased herself from the car, wincing. As her arthritic knees protested, Miller made no effort to assist her. "I smell marijuana," Miller declared, though there was nothing of the sort in Eleanor's car or possession. "I'm searching the vehicle. You don't have probable cause and I do not consent to a search," Eleanor stated firmly, drawing on decades of legal experience. Miller ignored her, roughly pushing past to begin rifling through her car. "Hands on." "The hood, spread your legs." "This is inappropriate," Eleanor said, but complied to avoid escalation. "My identification is in my purse on the passenger seat. It will confirm I'm Judge Eleanor Washington." "Sure it will," Miller muttered, emerging with her purse. He dug through it, pulling out her wallet and judicial identification card. He studied it, then smirked. "Nice fake ID, adding impersonating a federal official to your charges." "That is, not a fake," Eleanor said, indignation rising. "You can call the federal courthouse to verify my identity." "Shut up," Miller snapped, suddenly producing handcuffs. "Turn around. You're under arrest for resisting an officer and possession of falsified government documents. This is absurd," Eleanor protested. "I've done nothing wrong." Miller roughly grabbed her wrists, slamming the cuffs on with unnecessary force. Eleanor gasped as the metal bit into her thin skin. Across the street, a young woman had stopped and begun recording with her phone. "Officer, you're making a serious mistake," Eleanor said, her voice strained but dignified. "I said shut up," Miller snarled, reaching for his baton. When Eleanor opened her mouth to speak again, he swung, striking her temple with enough force to send her staggering against the car. Blood immediately began to flow from the gash. "Resisting arrest," Miller announced loudly, seemingly for the benefit of the bystander recording, "and attempting to assault an officer." As blood trickled down her face and her vision blurred, Eleanor Washington, Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court, was roughly shoved into the back of a police cruiser, her decades of service to justice meaning nothing in the face of one officer's prejudice and hate. The intake room of the Randall County Police Station smelled of disinfectant, sweat, and despair. Eleanor Washington sat ramrod straight on the metal bench, despite the throbbing pain in her temple and the constricting ache in her wrists. Blood had dried on the side of her face, forming a dark crust that pulled at her skin. When she'd asked for medical attention, the desk sergeant had laughed. "The doctor will get to you when he gets to you," he'd said, not bothering to look up from his computer. "Bunch of real criminals ahead of you in line." Eleanor had been photographed, fingerprinted, and processed like any common criminal. The indignity of it burned worse than her physical injuries. Throughout her career, she had visited many detention facilities, always treated with the respect her position commanded. Now she experienced the system from the other side, a system she was beginning to see in an entirely new light. "Hey, Johnny, come check out Thurgood Marshall over here," Officer Miller called to his colleagues, prompting several officers to gather around the booking desk. "Grandma thinks she's on the Supreme Court. I am Associate Justice Eleanor Washington of the Supreme Court of the United States," she repeated, her voice steady despite her humiliation. "How you can verify this with one phone call?" This sparked more laughter from the growing audience of officers. A heavy-set officer with a bushy mustache approached, leaning uncomfortably close to Eleanor's face. "Listen, lady, the crazy act isn't helping you. Drop it," another officer added. "Maybe she escaped from the psych ward at County General." Officer Miller returned with a faded orange jumpsuit. "Time to change, Your Honor," he mocked, throwing the jumpsuit at her. "I have not been convicted of any crime," Eleanor objected. "I will not change into prison attire." Miller signaled to a female officer. "Jenkins, help our distinguished guest into her new robes." Despite her protests, Eleanor was escorted to a bathroom and forced to change. The jumpsuit hung loose on her small frame, the ultimate indignity for a woman who had spent her life in tailored judicial robes and suits. When she attempted to retain her prescription medication for hypertension, Officer Jenkins confiscated it. "Can't have contraband," she said, dropping the pills into a plastic evidence bag. "Doctor has to approve any meds." "That medication is essential for my blood pressure," Eleanor explained. "Without it, I could suffer serious complications." "Should have thought about that before breaking the law," Jenkins replied indifferently. Led to a holding cell, Eleanor found herself among several other detainees, most of them black and brown. A young black man with a swollen eye sat huddled in the corner. An elderly Hispanic woman quietly wept on the opposite bench. Eleanor observed how the white detainees were processed more quickly, spoken to with less derision, and generally treated with more humanity. When Eleanor was finally permitted her phone call, she asked to contact Chief Justice Parker. The officer, monitoring the phone, snickered as she dialed, and just as the line began to ring, he pressed the disconnect button. "Oops," he said with exaggerated regret. "Guess your time's up." Hours passed. Eleanor watched as detainees came and went, while her paperwork seemed to vanish into administrative limbo. When she inquired about the status of her case, the desk sergeant claimed her documentation had been misplaced. From her cell, Eleanor witnessed a young black man in the adjacent holding area speak up about his rights. Within seconds, 2 officers entered his cell, nightsticks drawn. The sound of impacts and cries of pain echoed through the station. "Stop this at once," Eleanor called out. "This is police brutality." An officer passing by her cell paused. "Keep running your mouth, Grandma. See where that gets you." As evening turned to night, Eleanor felt her medical condition deteriorating. Without her medication, her blood pressure was rising dangerously. She felt lightheaded, and her vision occasionally blurred. When she mentioned these symptoms, she was ignored. A younger Hispanic man in her cell whispered, "Aren't you that judge, the one they just put on the Supreme Court?" Before she could respond, Officer Miller appeared, pointing at the man. "No talking. To the prisoner, unless you want trouble." The man immediately fell silent, but the recognition in his eyes gave Eleanor a momentary spark of hope. As the night deepened, Eleanor's discomfort increased. The bench offered no support for her aging back, and the bright fluorescent lights never dimmed. She closed her eyes, trying to center herself, when she heard a soft voice. "Ma'am, are you okay?" Eleanor opened her eyes to see a young officer, barely out of the academy by the look of him. Unlike the others, his expression held concern rather than contempt. "I'm fine, thank you," she replied carefully, unsure if this was another form of mockery. The young officer, Rodriguez, according to his nameplate, glanced around furtively, then slipped her a paper cup of water and 2 aspirin. "For your head," he whispered. "I'm sorry about all this. I know who you are." "Then why?" Eleanor began. "My uncle works as a clerk at the federal courthouse," Rodriguez interrupted softly. "I recognized you from his photos. I've called him, told him what happened. Help is coming, ma'am. Just hang on." Before Eleanor could thank him, Rodriguez hurried, away, leaving her with the first glimmer of hope since this nightmare began. What would you do if you were wrongfully detained and humiliated like Justice Washington? Comment number 1 if you believe the officers should face immediate termination, or number 2 if you think the entire system needs reform. Don't forget to like this video if you're stunned by this blatant injustice, and subscribe to follow. Eleanor's fight for dignity. Will Officer Rodriguez's secret call bring the help she desperately needs, or will the corrupt department silence him before justice can arrive? The holding area erupted into chaos shortly after 8 a.m. Eleanor, who had barely dozed during her night of detention, was startled awake by raised voices and hurried footsteps. She straightened up, wincing at the stiffness in her joints and the persistent throbbing in her temple. Through the glass partition, she could see officers rushing about, their expressions a mixture of confusion and alarm. The desk sergeant, who had been so dismissive the night before, was now on the phone, his face drained of color. He kept glancing in her direction with growing horror. Captain David Russell burst through the main doors, still buttoning his uniform, jacket as if he'd dressed in haste. He was a heavy-set man with salt and pepper hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to authority. His eyes locked on Eleanor's cell immediately. "Open it," he ordered sharply. "Now!" The electronic lock buzzed, and the door slid open. Captain Russell approached Eleanor with an entirely different demeanor than any officer she'd encountered so far. "Justice Washington," he said, his voice dripping with sudden deference, "I cannot express the depth of our regret for this misunderstanding." Eleanor remained seated, her posture regal despite her orange jumpsuit and dried blood. "Is it a misunderstanding, Captain? Or is it standard procedure in your department to assault citizens, ignore their rights, and deny them medical care?" Russell paled further. "There's been a terrible mistake. Chief Justice Parker just called our station directly. We had no idea of your identity." "And that makes your officer's conduct acceptable?" Eleanor asked pointedly. "Would this treatment be appropriate for any citizen, regardless of their position?" Before Russell could respond, Officer Miller was escorted in by 2 superior officers. His swagger from the previous day had vanished, replaced by nervous apprehension. "Officer Miller, you're suspended effective immediately. Pending investigation," Captain Russell announced. "Turn in your badge and weapon before leaving the building." Miller's face contorted with shock. "What? For arresting a woman who ran a stop sign and resisted?" "For arresting and assaulting an associate justice of the Supreme Court," Russell hissed. Miller's eyes widened as he finally grasped the magnitude of his actions. "That can't be. She was lying." Justice Washington's identity has been confirmed. By the Chief Justice himself, Russell said icily. Now go. As Miller was led away, a paramedic hurried in to attend to Eleanor's injuries. The wound on her temple was cleaned and bandaged, her blood pressure checked dangerously high, and her prescription medication miraculously found and returned. Justice Washington, Captain Russell continued, we've arranged for your immediate release and a police escort to your residence. Your vehicle is being retrieved from impound as we speak. All charges have been dropped, and we would be deeply grateful if I would keep this quiet. Eleanor finished for him. No, Captain Russell, I will not. Ma'am? Eleanor rose to her feet, drawing herself up to her full height. Though she stood only 5 feet 4 inches tall, her presence filled the room. I want the formal booking process completed, she stated clearly. I want every form filed, every step documented. I want officer reports written and submitted. I want the record to show exactly what happened here. But Justice Washington, surely we can handle this more discreetly, Russell stammered. There will be nothing discreet about what comes next, Captain, Eleanor replied, her voice carrying the weight of decades in courtrooms. I also require all body camera footage to be preserved, including Officer Miller's, the booking officers, and anyone else who interacted with me. Captain Russell's professional smile faltered. Some of that footage may have been corrupted. In upload. Technical difficulties. How convenient, Eleanor remarked dryly. Then I expect security camera footage from the station to be preserved instead. And I noticed cameras at the intersection where I was pulled over. Those too. Justice Washington, Russell tried again, his voice lowering conspiratorially. I understand you're upset. Anyone would be. But escalating this will only create problems. For everyone involved, perhaps we could discuss some form of accommodation. Eleanor fixed him with the same penetrating stare that had made countless attorneys falter at her bench. Are you attempting to bribe a federal judge, Captain? Russell blanched. No, of course not. I simply meant— Let me be perfectly clear, Eleanor interrupted, her voice steady and resolute. What happened to me yesterday happens to citizens of color across this country every day. The difference is I have the power and platform to do something about it. And I intend to. The station had gone utterly silent, every officer and staff member frozen, watching the confrontation. This isn't about one officer's misconduct, Eleanor continued. This is about a culture that permitted him to act as he did with apparent confidence that there would be no consequences. This is about every officer who witnessed my treatment and did nothing. This is about the systematic dehumanization of people of color by those sworn to protect and serve. Captain Russell's facade of contrition cracked, revealing a flash of the same contempt Miller had displayed. With all due respect, Justice Washington, I think you're overreacting to an unfortunate incident. Eleanor smiled thinly. With all due respect, Captain, I don't believe you've begun to understand the gravity of what has occurred here, but you will. Outside the station, cameras flashed as news vans began to arrive. The story was spreading like wildfire. A supreme court justice detained and assaulted by local police. Eleanor could see the gathering media through the windows, and so could Captain Russell. His expression hardened as he realized the situation was beyond containment. Very well, Justice Washington. We'll complete the booking process as requested and preserve all available evidence. But I hope you understand that Officer Miller's actions don't represent our department as a whole. That, said Eleanor Washington, sitting back down on the bench with quiet dignity, is exactly what we're about to find out. The sun was setting as Eleanor finally returned to her modest colonial home in the historic district of Bakersfield. The media throng that had gathered at the police station had followed her here, camping on the sidewalk beyond her property line. Camera flashes punctuated the growing darkness like lightning as she made her way up the walkway, supported by Michael Chen, her former law clerk and trusted friend who had rushed to her side when news broke. "Vultures," Michael muttered, guiding her past the shouted questions. Eleanor was exhausted, her body aching from the physical ordeal and lack of sleep. Yet part of her was gratified by the attention. Sunlight, she had always believed, was the Best disinfectant for the rot of injustice. Inside, Eleanor sank gratefully into her favorite armchair while Michael busied himself making tea. Her home, filled with books and mementos from a long career in law, had always been her sanctuary. Now it felt like the eye of a gathering storm. The Chief Justice called again, Michael reported, handing her a steaming cup. He's furious about how you were treated. Eleanor sipped the tea, letting its warmth soothe her. Good, his support will be crucial in what comes next. Which is, Michael asked, though he'd worked with her long enough to anticipate her answer. Justice, Eleanor said simply. Not just for me, but for everyone who's been subjected to this kind of treatment without a voice powerful enough to challenge it. Michael nodded, but his expression was troubled. They won't make it easy. They'll fight back. Eleanor had no idea how prophetic his words would prove to be or how quickly. By morning, the narrative had already begun to shift. Eleanor woke to Michael showing her the local newspaper's headline, Supreme Court Justice claims police brutality, officers' record spotless. The article quoted anonymous department sources, claiming Eleanor had been argumentative and threatening during the traffic stop. It prominently mentioned her past minor traffic violations, a parking ticket from 3 years ago and an expired registration from a decade earlier, as if these somehow justified her treatment. Her phone rang constantly. Colleagues, friends, journalists. Some calls, however, were just dead air or muffled breathing before disconnecting. The local television news ran a segment featuring Officer Miller's police union representative. Officer Miller has served this community with distinction for 8 years, the spokesperson declared. He followed proper procedure with an uncooperative motorist who ran a stop sign and refused to comply with lawful orders. When the reporter asked about Eleanor's injuries, the representative replied, Justice Washington unfortunately lost her balance during the standard arrest procedure. Officer Miller provided immediate assistance. That's an outright lie, Eleanor said to the television. The video evidence would prove it, if it still existed. Michael, who had been making calls to his contacts, entered with a grim expression. The body cam footage from Officer Miller has been declared corrupted during upload. They claim it's irrecoverable. Eleanor's lips thinned. How convenient. There's more, Michael continued reluctantly. The bystander who recorded the incident on her phone reported being visited by police officers last night. They suggested she delete the video to avoid involvement in a complicated legal matter. She did. Eleanor's hand tightened around her teacup. Intimidation of witnesses. Add it to the list. By midday, the local news cycle had taken an even uglier turn. A medical expert who had never examined Eleanor suggested that her age might have affected her perception of events. Another segment questioned whether generational trauma had caused her to misinterpret Officer Miller's standard procedures. For they're trying to paint me as senile or paranoid, Eleanor observed, her voice steady despite the profound insult. A typical tactic when facing an accuser they can't easily discredit otherwise. Michael showed her his tablet, where a right-wing blog had published a piece titled, Activist Judge Washington, History of Radical Decisions Revealed. The piece distorted her record on civil rights cases, portraying her consistent defense of constitutional protections as extremism. Captain Russell has been busy, Eleanor noted. This level of coordinated response suggests they're genuinely worried. Her landline rang, one of the few numbers not publicly available. Eleanor answered to hear Governor Harriet Chen's distinctive voice. Eleanor, this is outrageous, the governor said without preamble. I've known you for 20 years. What can I do? Eleanor felt a surge of gratitude. Having the state's highest official as an ally was no small thing. Thank you, Harriet. For now, just your public support means a great deal. You have it, Governor Chen assured her. I've directed the State Attorney General to monitor the situation closely. If that department thinks they can bury this, they're sorely mistaken. The call buoyed Eleanor's spirits, but the respite was brief. That evening, Michael discovered that someone had accessed Eleanor's private email account. Documents related to current Supreme Court cases had been copied. This is beyond retaliation, Michael said, horrified. This is a criminal act with national security implications. Eleanor contacted the Supreme Court security team immediately, then called the FBI. This had escalated beyond local police misconduct. As they waited for federal agents to arrive, Eleanor's doorbell rang. Michael checked the security camera and saw a young man in a delivery uniform holding a package. "I didn't order anything," Eleanor said suspiciously. Michael instructed the delivery person to leave the package on the porch. After the driver departed, Michael retrieved it cautiously. The return address was unfamiliar. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was a small broken doll with dark skin, dressed in what appeared to be black robes. A crude noose had been tied around its neck. Michael's face hardened with anger, but Eleanor remained remarkably calm as she photographed the threat. "Add it to the evidence file," she said quietly. Later that night, as Eleanor finally prepared for bed, her phone chimed with a text message from a blocked number. "Your clerk should watch his back. Accidents happen." Eleanor immediately called Michael, who had returned to his own apartment. "Michael, you're in danger. I've received a threat against you." "I'm all right," he assured her, though his voice was tense. "I've already asked a friend to stay with me tonight." "This isn't just about me anymore," Eleanor realized aloud. "They're willing to target anyone associated with me." "Then they shouldn't have picked a fight with the most principled person I know," Michael replied with fierce loyalty. As Eleanor tried to sleep that night, her home's power suddenly cut out, plunging the house into darkness. Outside, she heard the distinctive sound of a car slowly driving by, then stopping. Footsteps approached her porch, then retreated after several tense minutes. In the darkness, Eleanor Washington faced the truth. This was no longer just about seeking justice. This had become a battle for survival against forces that would resort to any tactic to protect their power and privilege. And they had just escalated from institutional bullying to personal threats. Yet, in the face of this intimidation, Eleanor felt a strange calm. Throughout her life, from the segregated schools of her childhood to the marble halls of the highest court, she had never backed down from fighting injustice. She wouldn't start now, even as the personal cost mounted. Have you ever witnessed authority figures abusing their power when challenged? Comment number 1 if you've seen retaliation against those who speak truth to power, or number 2 if you believe the police department's coordinated attacks against Justice Washington crossed the line into criminal territory. Like this video if you're astounded by Eleanor's courage in the face of such dangerous intimidation, and subscribe to see how she builds her case against a system determined to silence her. Will Governor Chen's support be enough to protect Eleanor, or will the department's increasingly dangerous tactics put her life at risk before justice can be served? The morning light filtered through Eleanor's curtains, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. She had slept fitfully, waking at every sound outside her window. The power had returned sometime after 3 a.m., but the message had been delivered. They could reach her whenever they wanted. Michael arrived early, bringing breakfast and determination. He had gained weight since clerking for her 15 years ago, and grey now peppered his temples, but his brilliant legal mind remained sharp, as ever. As they sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by legal pads and laptops, Eleanor outlined her strategy. "They expect me to file a simple civil rights lawsuit against Officer Miller and possibly Captain Russell," she explained. "A narrow case they can settle quietly with a forced apology and some nominal damages." Michael nodded. "The standard playbook." "But we're not going to do that," Eleanor continued, her eyes gleaming with purpose. "We're going to expose the entire system." Together they crafted a methodical approach. First, they needed evidence beyond Eleanor's testimony. Despite the department's efforts to erase records of the incident, there were always traces if you knew where to look. "The intersection where I was pulled over," Eleanor recalled. "There was a convenience store on the corner. They might have security cameras covering the street." Michael made a note. "I'll visit them today." By afternoon, Michael had secured the footage. The grainy video clearly showed Eleanor's car coming to a complete stop at the intersection before proceeding legally. Officer Miller's patrol car had been parked just beyond the intersection, pulling out immediately to follow her. He was hunting, Eleanor observed grimly, waiting for a black driver to pass through his territory. Their next task was documenting Eleanor's injuries. Though the hospital had treated her wounds, Michael had noticed the medical report seemed sanitized, listing her head wound as a minor abrasion despite requiring 3 stitches. They arranged for an independent medical examination, which properly documented the baton strike as consistent with significant blunt force trauma, rather than accidentally striking her head during standard arrest procedures, as the police report claimed. While reviewing public records, Michael made a critical discovery. "Eleanor, look at this," he said, turning his laptop toward her. "Officer Miller has been involved in 3 previous excessive force complaints, all filed by black citizens. All 3 cases were settled quietly with non-disclosure agreements." "Who signed off on those settlements?" Eleanor asked. Michael scrolled through the documents. "Judge William Harrison." Eleanor's eyebrows rose. "Mayor Jackson's former law partner. The connection begins to make sense." As they dug deeper, the pattern emerged. Complaints against Randall County officers by people of color were systematically routed to Judge Harrison, who dismissed them or approved settlements that buried the details. The mayor's office expedited these settlements using taxpayer funds. "We need to find others who've experienced similar treatment," Eleanor decided. "This isn't about one incident. It's about a pattern and practice." Michael began searching through court records and community contacts. By the end of the week, they had identified 5 elderly black citizens who reported experiences eerily similar to Eleanor's: minor or fabricated traffic violations, escalated confrontations, excessive force, and dismissal of complaints. "They target the vulnerable," Eleanor observed. "People they assume won't have the resources or credibility to fight back." As they built their case, the intimidation continued. Eleanor's home internet service mysteriously failed. Her personal computer showed signs of hacking with case notes missing or altered. When Michael brought his laptop to a cybersecurity expert, they discovered sophisticated spyware typically used by law enforcement. Then came the vandalism. Eleanor woke one morning to find racial slurs spray-painted across her garage door. The police officers who responded took hours to arrive and seemed more interested in asking about her case than investigating the crime. "Standard intimidation tactics," Eleanor noted calmly, as a cleanup crew worked to remove the hateful words. "They want me rattled, off balance, afraid. Aren't you?" Michael asked quietly. Eleanor watched the slurs dissolve under the power washer's spray. "I marched in Selma, Michael. I've had much worse than words directed at me." The next day, Michael failed to arrive at their usual meeting time. When Eleanor called, there was no answer. Increasingly concerned, she contacted Michael's partner, who hadn't seen him since he left for her house that morning. Just as Eleanor was preparing to call the police, despite her misgivings, Michael called from the hospital. His voice was slurred from pain medication. "2 men jumped me in the parking garage," he explained. "They said to tell you to stop digging, or worse would come." Eleanor's hand tightened on the phone. "How badly are you hurt?" "Broken rib, concussion. Lots of bruises, I'll live." He paused. "Eleanor, they knew exactly who I was and why they were attacking me. This wasn't random." "No," Eleanor agreed, ice in her voice. "It wasn't." Despite Michael's injuries, their work continued. Eleanor converted her dining room into a war room, walls covered with evidence and connections. They were no longer just building a case. They were mapping a conspiracy that reached from patrol officers to the highest levels of local government. Their breakthrough came when Officer Rodriguez, the young officer who had helped Eleanor in detention, contacted them secretly. He had been disciplined for unprofessional conduct after Eleanor's release, but remained on the force. "The department has weekly targeting meetings," he revealed in a hushed meeting at a coffee shop 3 towns over. "They identify high-value enforcement zones, which always happen to be predominantly black neighborhoods. Officers are incentivized to make arrests and issue citations in these areas." "Incentivized how?" Eleanor asked. "Preferred shifts, overtime, opportunities, faster promotion track," Rodriguez explained. "Miller was on the fast track. Captain Russell personally mentored him." When Eleanor asked why he was risking his career to help, Rodriguez looked down at his coffee. "My grandmother was pulled over in this town 10 years ago. The officer dragged her from her car when she asked why she'd been stopped. She broke her hip. No one believed her about what happened." He looked up, resolute. "I became a cop to change things from the inside. but the system just changes you instead. That evening, Eleanor received a call from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Her complaint about the hacking had led to a preliminary investigation, and they found her situation potentially connected to other civil rights violations they were examining. "This goes beyond local misconduct, Justice Washington," the agent explained. "The pattern you've identified may constitute a conspiracy to violate constitutional rights under color of law." For the first time since her ordeal began, Eleanor felt the momentum shifting. The local department could intimidate witnesses and manipulate local media, but they couldn't control federal investigators or national attention. As if sensing their growing vulnerability, the intimidation attempts intensified. Eleanor's sister in Chicago reported police cars parked outside her home. Michael's medical records were mysteriously accessed. Anonymous online posts began questioning Eleanor's mental fitness for the Supreme Court, but Eleanor Washington had not risen to the nation's highest court by backing down from challenges. Each act of intimidation only strengthened her resolve and confirmed the righteousness of her cause. "They're scared," she told Michael during his first day back after the attack. "And they should be." With methodical precision, Eleanor continued, building an airtight case, gathering witnesses, documenting patterns, and preparing for the battle that would soon engulf the Randall County Police Department. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about decades of unchecked abuse finally facing a reckoning. As Eleanor reviewed their evidence wall, her phone rang. It was Patricia Johnson, president of the National Civil Rights Legal Defense Fund, STCA. "Washington, we've been following your situation closely," Johnson said. "Our organization would like to offer our full legal resources to support your case." Eleanor smiled for the first time in days. "Ms. Johnson, I would be honored to accept your help. I believe we're about to make some very important law together." The press conference on the steps of the federal courthouse drew media from across the country. Eleanor Washington stood at the podium, her posture impeccable despite the lingering pain from her injuries, flanked by Michael Chen and attorneys. From the National Civil Rights Legal Defense Fund, she addressed the nation with the measured cadence that had characterized her judicial career. "No citizen should fear those sworn to protect them," she stated, her voice strong despite her 78 years. "What happened to me was not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern of discriminatory and abusive policing that has persisted for decades in Randall County and across our nation." As Eleanor detailed her experience, the cameras captured every word. Her description of being struck with a baton, denied medical care, and subjected to humiliation resonated far beyond Bakersfield. By evening, the footage had gone viral, with millions of views and the hashtag Justice for Judge Washington trending nationally. The response was swift and divided. Civil rights organizations rallied behind her. Legal scholars expressed outrage. The Supreme Court issued an unprecedented statement supporting their colleague and expressing grave concern about the treatment of Justice Washington and the implications for equal justice under law. But the backlash was equally fierce. Within 48 hours, the police union organized a rally supporting Officer Miller. Hundreds gathered, many wearing T-shirts reading "Back the Blue" and carrying signs declaring Miller did his job. Captain Russell seized the narrative, appearing on conservative news programs to paint Eleanor as an activist judge, exploiting a routine traffic stop for political purposes. Officer Miller had no idea who she was, he insisted. He was simply following procedure with an uncooperative subject. The department released carefully edited portions of station security footage showing Eleanor speaking firmly to officers, but conspicuously missing the segments showing her being denied medical care or officers mocking her. This selective release of evidence is telling, Michael pointed out during their own media appearances. If the full footage supported their version of events, why not release it all? The battle lines were drawn, with Americans increasingly divided over whose version they believed. Eleanor's past judicial decisions were scrutinized and distorted. Conservative commentators questioned her impartiality in cases involving law enforcement. Articles appeared examining her radical history in the civil rights movement of the 1960s. "They're trying to discredit me by highlighting the very work I'm most proud of," Eleanor remarked to Michael as they reviewed the latest coverage. The online attacks grew increasingly personal and vicious. Social media accounts with suspicious patterns of activity began questioning Eleanor's mental acuity and fitness for the Supreme Court. Manipulated photos appeared, showing her at civil rights protests, falsely labeled as violent demonstrations. Death threats arrived daily, forcing Eleanor to relocate temporarily to a secure location. The Supreme Court assigned her additional security detail, an unprecedented step for a sitting justice outside of the Washington, D.C. area. Even the highest levels of government became entangled. The president held a press conference where he carefully straddled both sides. "I have tremendous respect for Justice Washington and her service to our nation," he stated. "I also respect the difficult job our law enforcement officers do every day. We must let the legal process determine the facts in this matter." The equivocation infuriated Eleanor. "The evidence is on video," she told Michael. "My injuries were documented. What more does he need to see?" "Political calculation," Michael replied cynically. "He doesn't want to alienate either constituency." Through it all, Eleanor maintained her judicial temperament, refusing to be baited into angry responses that might undermine her credibility. Instead, she channeled her energy into a powerful television interview with a respected national news program. Sitting in her temporary residence, surrounded by law books that grounded her, Eleanor spoke directly to the American people. She didn't just recount her experience, she contextualized it within the broader struggle for equal justice. "What happened to me in that police station happens to Black Americans every day," she explained. "The difference is that I have the platform and resources to fight back. Most victims of police misconduct do not." The interview resonated deeply, humanizing what had become an increasingly polarized issue. Viewers saw not just a Supreme Court justice, but a 78-year-old grandmother who had been bloodied and humiliated for driving while Black. The hashtag, "I stand with Justice Washington," exploded online. As public opinion began shifting in Eleanor's favor, the department's tactics grew more desperate. They filed a countersuit, claiming Eleanor had defamed Officer Miller and the entire department, seeking millions in damages. "A transparent attempt to silence me," Eleanor noted when the lawsuit was announced. "They've dramatically underestimated my resolve." Days later, Eleanor discovered her bank accounts had been frozen due to an anonymous report of suspicious activity. Her credit cards were declined when she attempted to purchase groceries. The banking freeze required days to resolve, during which Eleanor relied on Michael to cover her basic expenses. "They're trying to isolate and impoverish me," Eleanor observed. Classic tactics against someone challenging power structures. Yet for every escalation from the department, unexpected support emerged. 3 officers from the Randall County Police Department, inspired by Officer Rodriguez's courage, reached out anonymously to Eleanor's legal team. They provided accounts of systematic discrimination within the department and confirmed the targeting of minority neighborhoods for heightened enforcement. "The blue wall of silence is cracking," Eleanor told Michael as they reviewed the officers' statements. The most damning evidence came from an anonymous email containing internal department communication about Eleanor's arrest. The messages exchanged between Captain Russell and several senior officers revealed a deliberate campaign to humiliate her and destroy evidence. "Delete the booking videos," one message from Russell read. "Make sure Miller's body cam footage has technical issues. We need to control the narrative here." The whistleblower identified themselves only as conscience, but their information proved invaluable, providing direction for document requests and subpoenas. As the public battle intensified, Eleanor never lost sight of her ultimate goal: systemic change. While the media focused on the sensational aspects of her story, she remained focused on the legal strategy that would force accountability not just for her treatment, but for the department's long-standing pattern of abuse. "They want this to be about one incident and one officer," she explained during a strategy session with her expanding legal team. "We need to ensure it remains focused on the systemic issues. This isn't about me. It's about justice for everyone who has suffered what I suffered. Without the platform, I have to fight back." Despite the department's increasingly desperate attempts to discredit her, Eleanor Washington stood firm, her resolve strengthened by each attack. The public battle had taken its toll. Her health had suffered. Her privacy had been invaded, her safety threatened. But as the tide of public opinion gradually turned in her favor, she knew that the most difficult battle still lay ahead, proving in court what she had experienced firsthand, that the injustice she suffered was not an anomaly, but standard, operating procedure within a deeply corrupted system. Do you believe powerful institutions should be held accountable when they abuse their authority? Comment number 1 if you think Justice Washington's fight represents countless silent victims of systemic abuse. Or number 2 if you're inspired by the officers who risked their careers to expose corruption from within. Like this video if you're amazed by Eleanor's courage under such intense pressure, and subscribe to witness the shocking revelations coming next. Will the conscience whistleblower's evidence be enough to crack the department's wall of denial, or will Eleanor face even more dangerous retaliation as she gets closer to the truth? The documents arrived in an unmarked manila envelope slipped under the door of Michael's temporary office. Inside was a flash drive and a handwritten note. Start with the quota system. Follow the money. Michael and Eleanor gathered around his laptop as he inserted the drive. What they found stunned them both. Internal department spreadsheets tracking officer productivity by neighborhood, with explicit targets for citations, arrests, and vehicle searches in predominantly minority areas. "This is the smoking gun," Michael whispered, scrolling through years of data. "They've been systematically targeting black neighborhoods for years." Eleanor studied the numbers, her judicial mind quickly recognizing the pattern. Look at these disparities. Officers in predominantly white neighborhoods have citation quotas 1/5 the size of those in black neighborhoods, but the quota system was just the beginning. As Michael dug deeper into the files, he uncovered a web of corruption extending far beyond racially biased policing. "Eleanor, look at this," he said, opening another spreadsheet. "They're tracking asset forfeitures by officer. There are bonus structures tied to the value of property seized. Civil asset forfeiture, the practice of police seizing property, allegedly connected to crimes, had long been criticized by civil rights advocates. But the Randall County Police Department had turned it into a profit center, with officers incentivized to confiscate vehicles, cash, and even homes from citizens who often couldn't afford the legal fight to reclaim their property. The data showed that over 70% of these seizures came from black and Latino neighborhoods, despite these areas constituting only 30% of the county's population. They're not just targeting minorities for harassment, Eleanor realized. They're systematically extracting wealth from these communities. Following the money trail led to an even more disturbing discovery. The department had a special arrangement with Clearwater Corrections Corporation, a private prison company that operated the county detention center. Mayor Jackson had received substantial campaign contributions from Clearwater, and the county had a bed guarantee contract that required keeping the facility at least 85% full. "It's a pipeline," Eleanor said grimly. "Target minority neighborhoods, make aggressive arrests for minor offenses, funnel people into a private prison that profits from each incarceration, and the mayor gets campaign funds in return." Michael discovered that Judge William Harrison, the same judge who dismissed complaints against officers, had invested heavily in Clearwater Corrections through a shell company. The conflict of interest was breathtaking. As they mapped the connections, they found falsified police reports where simple encounters had been dramatically embellished to justify arrests. Black citizens' complaints were systematically buried, labeled unfounded, without investigation. "There's a pattern to which judges receive these cases," Michael noted, tracking the court assignments. "Judge Harrison handles nearly 80% of all police misconduct complaints." Further investigation revealed that Harrison was more than just mayor. Jackson's former law partner, he was the mayor's brother-in-law, a relationship not publicly disclosed but confirmed through marriage records. The conspiracy extended to the department's training materials. While publicly available materials emphasize community policing and unbiased enforcement, Internal training documents instructed officers on criminal indicators that were thinly veiled racial profiling directives. Look for vehicles with specific modifications common in urban communities, one training document advised. Pay special attention to individuals wearing styles associated with urban culture. They're encoding racial profiling in their official training, Eleanor said, disgusted, while publicly denying they engage in the practice. The most shocking discovery came when Michael uncovered Officer Miller's personnel file. Despite the department's claims of his spotless record, Miller had been the subject of 7 excessive force complaints in 8 years. All had been dismissed by Harrison or settled with non-disclosure agreements. More disturbing still, Miller wasn't just a random officer. He was Mayor Jackson's nephew, fast-tracked through the police academy despite marginal performance. This explains why the department reacted so aggressively to protect him, Eleanor said. It's not just about one officer. It's about protecting the mayor's family and the entire corrupt system. As they assembled the evidence, Michael's apartment was broken into. His computer was stolen along with all physical documents related to the case. However, anticipating such a move, they had already secured backup copies in multiple locations. The intimidation escalated. Judge Rodriguez, Eleanor's former mentee who had been assigned her federal case, received a threatening letter referencing his children by name and school location. Though shaken, Rodriguez refused to recuse himself, instead requesting additional courthouse security. They're getting desperate, Eleanor observed. They know what we've uncovered could dismantle not just the police department, but the entire power structure of Randall County. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when Eleanor received an anonymous call from a courthouse clerk. The clerk revealed that Mayor Jackson had personally called Judge Harrison immediately after learning of Eleanor's arrest, setting in motion the department's coordinated response. The mayor said, and I quote, "Make this go away like the others," the clerk reported. That's when they started destroying evidence. Armed with this comprehensive evidence of corruption, Eleanor and her legal team prepared to move their case beyond a simple civil rights complaint to a RICO, racketeer-influenced and corrupt organizations action, treating the department, mayor's office and private prison company as a criminal enterprise. As word of their investigation spread, State Attorney General Diane Lawson contacted Eleanor personally. "Justice Washington, my office has been monitoring your situation closely. Based on the evidence you've gathered, I'm opening a formal investigation into the Randall County Police Department and the mayor's office." Eleanor welcomed the support, but remained cautious. This corruption has persisted because it has protection at multiple levels. We need to ensure this investigation can't be interfered with politically. Lawson agreed. "I've already requested FBI assistance. This has crossed into federal jurisdiction on multiple fronts." The FBI's involvement marked a significant escalation, bringing resources and authority that the local power structure couldn't easily obstruct. That evening, as Eleanor reviewed the mountain of evidence they'd assembled, she felt both vindication and sadness. What had begun as her personal quest for justice had revealed a systemic exploitation of an entire community, operating in plain sight for decades. This was never about one traffic stop or one officer's misconduct, she told Michael, as they prepared their formal RICO complaint. This was about a criminal enterprise masquerading as a justice system. Michael, still sporting bruises from his assault, nodded grimly. And they nearly got away with it again, if they had pulled over anyone else that day. But they didn't, Eleanor said, her voice filled with quiet determination. They pulled over exactly the wrong person at exactly the right time. The federal courthouse buzzed with tension as Eleanor Washington, supported by Michael Chen and her expanded legal team, filed their sweeping civil rights lawsuit against the Randall County Police Department, the mayor's office, Judge Harrison, and Clearwater Corrections Corporation. The 70-page complaint detailed not just Eleanor's personal experience, but the systematic persecution of black citizens throughout the county. Media crews crowded the courthouse steps as Eleanor addressed reporters. "Today we seek justice not just for what was done to me, but for every citizen who has suffered similar treatment without the resources or platform to fight back, she stated. This lawsuit aims to dismantle a corrupt system that has operated with impunity for far too long. The defendant's reaction was immediate. The department's high-priced legal team filed an emergency motion to dismiss, claiming sovereign immunity and arguing that Eleanor's Supreme Court position created an inherent conflict of interest. "They're desperate," Michael observed as they reviewed the motion. "These arguments are legally frivolous, but they're hoping to delay proceedings until public interest wanes." The case was assigned to Judge Antonio Rodriguez, a federal judge who had clerked for Eleanor early in his career. The department immediately filed a motion for his recusal, claiming bias. Rodriguez addressed this in his first hearing. "I did indeed clerk for Justice Washington 20 years ago, which I disclosed immediately upon assignment to this case. However, our professional relationship does not constitute grounds for automatic recusal under federal standards. The motion for recusal is denied." His voice hardened as he continued. "Furthermore, I find the motion to dismiss without legal merit. The plaintiffs have established standing and properly alleged constitutional violations that pierce sovereign immunity. This case will proceed to discovery." It was their first significant victory. Rodriguez issued a preservation order for all evidence, including electronic communications, meaning any further destruction of evidence would constitute contempt of court. The department's attorneys then adopted a new strategy, offering Eleanor a substantial personal settlement, $2 million in damages with a non-disclosure agreement. "They're trying to buy your silence," Michael noted during their strategy meeting. Eleanor dismissed the offer without hesitation. "This was never about money. It's about structural change and accountability." When her refusal was conveyed, the pressure tactics escalated. Several of Eleanor's Supreme Court colleagues suggested privately that pursuing the case might compromise her ability to rule impartially on future police matters. "Perhaps a settlement would be the most prudent course," one justice advised during a private call. "You've made your point, Eleanor. The department has been publicly shamed." "With respect," Eleanor replied firmly, "public embarrassment without structural change accomplishes nothing. The same abuses will continue once the spotlight moves on." The Chief Justice was more supportive, but still concerned. "The court's credibility relies on public perception of impartiality. A protracted legal battle puts you in an adversarial position against law enforcement generally." "I would argue, Chief," Eleanor countered, "that the court's credibility ultimately rests on upholding justice for all citizens, regardless of who violates their rights. My silence would undermine that mission more than my advocacy ever could." Despite the institutional pressure, Eleanor stood firm. Her resolve was reinforced when Judge Rodriguez ruled that she could seek punitive damages against the department and individual officers, significantly raising the financial stakes. The department's next tactic was witness intimidation. Tuavai. The former detainees who had agreed to testify about similar experiences reported being pulled over multiple times by Randall County officers. One found his business suddenly subject to code enforcement inspections. Eleanor's legal team documented each instance of apparent retaliation, strengthening their case while seeking protective orders for witnesses. The breakthrough came when Judge Rodriguez certified the case as a class action, allowing all black citizens who had experienced similar treatment in Randall County over the past decade to join as plaintiffs. This transformed Eleanor's individual complaint into a sweeping indictment of the entire system. This certification acknowledges that the alleged conduct represents a pattern rather than isolated incidents, Rodriguez wrote in his ruling. The court finds sufficient evidence of commonality among potential class members to proceed under Rule 23. The class action designation was like breaking a dam. Hundreds of Randall County residents came forward with stories mirroring Eleanor's experience. The lawsuit now represented not just one Supreme Court justice, but an entire community that had suffered in silence for generations. County officials, recognizing the potentially catastrophic financial liability, attempted to negotiate a settlement that included modest police reforms but limited financial damages. They're offering implicit bias training for officers and a civilian review board, Michael reported after meeting with county attorneys. But the review board would be appointed by the mayor and have no actual authority beyond making recommendations. Cosmetic changes, Eleanor dismissed. Nothing that would prevent the same abuses from continuing under a different guise. Eleanor countered with demands for structural reform, independent prosecution of police misconduct, automatic Justice Department review of racial disparities in enforcement, elimination of quota systems, seizure reform, termination of the private prison contract, and substantial community reparations. These terms are non-negotiable, she informed the county through her attorneys. Any settlement must include meaningful enforceable change. When the county balked, Eleanor made it clear she was prepared to take the case to trial, where all evidence of corruption would become public record. The turning point came when Judge Rodriguez ruled on admissibility of evidence. Over strenuous objections from the defense, he allowed Eleanor's legal team to introduce Officer Miller's previous complaints as pattern evidence. He also admitted the department's internal data on racially disproportionate enforcement and the quota system documentation. The court finds these materials directly relevant to establishing the plaintiff's claims of systematic discrimination, Rodriguez wrote. While potentially prejudicial, their probative value substantially outweighs any prejudicial effect. This ruling effectively gutted the department's defense strategy. With their most damning practices now admissible as evidence, the prospect of a public trial terrified county officials. Mayor Jackson personally reached out to the governor, seeking political intervention. The governor, however, had publicly backed Eleanor and refused to pressure her to settle. The department's attorneys made a final desperate attempt to limit damages by offering a substantial class settlement of $50 million, while still requiring all plaintiffs to sign non-disclosure agreements. Eleanor called a meeting of class representatives to discuss the offer. In the community center of Bakersfield's historically black East Side neighborhood, she addressed dozens of citizens who had joined the lawsuit. This offer would provide financial compensation, she acknowledged. Many of you would receive substantial payments for the injustices you've suffered, but the non-disclosure requirement means your stories would remain untold. The full truth of what happened in Randall County would stay hidden. An elderly man stood shakily. I was beaten by Randall County officers in 1982 for asking why I was being pulled over. They broke my leg in 3 places. I couldn't work for 6 months and lost my house. No amount of money can give me back what they took, but maybe my grandchildren could live in a place where this doesn't happen to them. One by one, class members shared similar stories spanning decades. The consensus became clear. While the financial compensation was needed, lasting change was more important. Eleanor brought their decision back to the county. They would proceed to trial unless the settlement removed the non-disclosure requirement and included all structural reforms they had demanded. Faced with the prospect of a public trial that would expose generations of abuse and corruption, the county finally capitulated. The settlement agreement included every reform Eleanor had demanded, substantial financial compensation for victims, and critically, no non-disclosure requirement. The stories would be told. As Eleanor signed the settlement documents, she felt a complex mixture of emotions. Vindication, certainly, but also awareness that this victory, significant as it was, represented just one county in a nation where similar abuses occurred daily. We've won an important battle, she told Michael, as they left the courthouse amid a swarm of reporters. But the larger war continues. Neither of them realized that forces within the department were already plotting to undermine the settlement through a technical legal maneuver that would take their fight all the way to the Supreme Court, where Eleanor would face her greatest challenge yet. What price would you put on justice after decades of systematic abuse? Comment number 1 if you believe Eleanor was right to reject money in favor of structural reform. Or number 2, if you think the victims deserved immediate financial compensation without conditions. Like this video, if you're inspired by the class members who chose lasting change over personal gain, and subscribe to see if this hard-won victory will actually transform the broken system. The department has surrendered in court, but will they find a way to escape accountability through legal technicalities? The settlement should have marked the end of Eleanor Washington's ordeal. Instead, it triggered the most dangerous phase of her fight for justice. As the details of the agreement became public, those implicated in the corruption faced not just civil penalties, but potential criminal charges. With everything to lose, they resorted to increasingly desperate and dangerous tactics. Michael Chen left Eleanor's temporary residence just after 9 p.m., having finalized implementation details for the police reforms. The night was clear, but moonless, as he drove toward his apartment. He never saw the dark sedan that followed him from 6 car lengths back. 3 miles from Eleanor's home, Michael's brakes failed as he approached a sharp curve. The car careened off the road, rolling twice before slamming into a tree. Only the vehicle's advanced safety features saved his life, though he sustained 3 broken ribs, a concussion, and a shattered collarbone. The mechanic who later examined the wreckage found clear evidence of tampering. Brake lines were deliberately cut, the police report stated, approximately 90% through, ensuring they would fail under pressure rather than immediately, making the sabotage less detectable during routine operation. Eleanor rushed to the hospital, where Michael lay surrounded by monitoring equipment. "They're escalating," he whispered when they were alone. "They've moved from intimidation to attempted murder." Eleanor contacted the FBI immediately, and agents were assigned to guard Michael's hospital room. She also requested additional security for her own protection, sensing that if they had targeted Michael, she would likely be next. She was right. 2 nights later, Eleanor awoke to the sound of breaking glass. Someone had shattered her back door. The security system blared as she called 911 from her bedroom, barricading the door with a heavy dresser. Police arrived within minutes, but the intruder had fled, leaving behind a single black glove and footprints in the garden soil. The FBI advised Eleanor to relocate immediately to a secure location. She moved to a hotel under an assumed name, with round-the-clock federal protection. Even there, she didn't feel safe. Each unexpected sound caused her heart to race, and she slept fitfully, if at all. The attack on her security wasn't just physical. Marcus Thompson, a key witness who had documented the department's quota system, disappeared the night before he was scheduled to give his deposition. His apartment showed signs of a struggle: overturned furniture, a broken lamp, drops of blood on the carpet. "We're treating this as a potential kidnapping," the FBI agent in charge informed Eleanor. Mr. Thompson received multiple threatening calls in the days leading up to his disappearance. As the investigation into Thompson's disappearance proceeded, Eleanor learned of a secret meeting between Mayor Jackson and Supreme Court Chief Justice Parker. The two had been seen dining at an exclusive restaurant outside of Washington, D.C., far from the media's watchful eye. When Eleanor contacted the Chief Justice for an explanation, his response was evasive. "It was a social engagement, Eleanor. Nothing more." Eleanor didn't believe it for a second. "Did he ask you to pressure me to drop the case?" Parker's hesitation told her everything. He expressed concern about the impact on judicial-executive relations. "I informed him that the Supreme Court does not interfere in the personal legal matters of its members." "But the suggestion was made," Eleanor pressed. "It was floated," Parker admitted reluctantly. "I rejected it categorically," Eleanor wondered. How many other officials had received similar overtures from the mayor? The web of influence extended further than she had initially realized. Days later, Eleanor received notice of an ethics complaint filed against her with the Judicial Council. The complainant, listed as a concerned citizen, alleged that her lawsuit represented a conflict of interest with her Supreme Court duties. The complaint was thin on legal reasoning, but thick with insinuations about her mental competence and vendetta against law enforcement. The timing made the source obvious, but the complaint still required formal response and investigation. Eleanor now faced potential censure from the very institution she had served with distinction. While Eleanor prepared her response to the ethics complaint, pressure mounted from another direction. The chief medical officer at Bakersfield Memorial Hospital, where she had received treatment after her arrest, contacted her personal physician, Dr. Williams. He asked detailed questions about my cognitive function, Dr. Williams reported to Eleanor during her checkup. He implied the hospital was conducting a quality review of my treatment, but the questions seemed focused on whether I might be experiencing age-related cognitive decline. They're building a case to declare me mentally unfit, Eleanor realized. If they can't intimidate me or discredit the evidence, they'll try to discredit me personally. The surveillance became increasingly blatant. Unmarked police vehicles followed Eleanor whenever she left her hotel. When she attended church, a man with a police-issued radio sat 2 pews behind her, making no effort to conceal his presence. Officer. Miller, meanwhile, had been quietly reinstated to administrative duty pending the outcome of the internal investigation, an investigation being conducted by his direct supervisors. The message was clear. Despite the settlement agreement, the department had no intention of holding him accountable. The most chilling escalation came when Eleanor's sister, Martha, called from Chicago, her voice shaking with fear. "There's been a police car parked outside my house for 3 days, Martha reported. "This morning, that Officer Miller was standing on my porch when I opened the blinds. He just stared at me, Eleanor. Didn't say anything, just stared with this horrible smile." Eleanor immediately contacted the FBI, who arranged protection for Martha. Officer Miller denied ever being in Chicago, and Captain Russell claimed he had been on duty in Bakersfield at the time Martha reported seeing him. Their alibi was supported by department attendance records, records Eleanor strongly suspected had been falsified. Just when it seemed the intimidation couldn't intensify further, Eleanor received a breakthrough from an unexpected source. A National Investigative Journalism team had begun examining police misconduct in Bakersfield following Eleanor's case. Their tech expert had recovered portions of Miller's allegedly corrupted body camera footage from the department's cloud storage. The footage wasn't actually corrupted, the journalist explained when she met Eleanor at a secure location. It was deliberately edited to remove incriminating sections, but the originals were backed up to their cloud provider before deletion. Their IT department doesn't understand how digital forensics works. The recovered footage clearly showed Miller striking Eleanor with his baton unprovoked and mocking her claims about being a judge. It contradicted every aspect of the department's narrative about the incident. As this evidence emerged, Officer Rodriguez, the young officer who had secretly helped Eleanor during her detention, made a momentous decision. He came forward publicly with a secret recording from a department meeting where Captain Russell explicitly instructed officers on how to handle the aftermath of Eleanor's arrest. "Delete any recordings that make us look bad," Russell could be heard saying on the recording. "Anyone asks questions, the story is she was combative and injured herself during standard restraint procedures. We all stick together on this, or we all go down." Rodriguez knew his police career was over the moment he released the recording, but as he told reporters, "I became an officer to uphold the law, not to help cover up crimes against the people. We're supposed to protect." The recording and recovered body cam footage blew apart the department's carefully constructed narrative. Public opinion, already trending in Eleanor's favor, shifted dramatically with this irrefutable evidence of a cover-up. For Eleanor, the vindication came with a heavy price. She now lived like a fugitive, separated from her home and normal life, constantly looking over her shoulder. Michael remained hospitalized, Thompson was still missing, and the ethics complaint threatened her judicial career. Yet these desperate, dangerous acts of retaliation only confirmed what Eleanor had alleged from the beginning. The Randall County Police Department operated as if above the law, willing to terrorize anyone who challenged their authority, even a Supreme Court justice. Eleanor reviewed the mounting evidence with her security team. She knew they had reached the point of no return. The corruption she had uncovered was fighting for its survival, using every weapon at its disposal. The only path forward was to expose everything, no matter the personal cost. They're not just fighting to avoid accountability for what happened to me, she told the FBI agents assigned to her protection. They're fighting to preserve a system of power and exploitation that's enriched them for decades. That makes them more dangerous than I initially understood. The lead agent nodded grimly. Justice Washington, based on these escalating threats, we're recommending you be moved to a federal safe house until the criminal investigation is complete. Eleanor Washington, who had sat on the highest court in the land, now faced the prospect of going into hiding to preserve her safety. It was an extraordinary measure that reflected the extraordinary danger she faced for one simple act, demanding justice while black in America. The recovered body camera footage hit the internet like a thunderclap. Within hours, millions had watched Officer Miller strike Eleanor Washington with his baton, seen him mock her claims of being a judge, and witnessed the callous treatment she received at the station. The department's carefully constructed narrative collapsed overnight. National news networks ran the footage on continuous loop. Legal analysts expressed outrage. Civil rights leaders organized marches in cities across the country. The hashtag #ReJustice for Judge Washington, which had been trending for weeks, now dominated social media platforms. In Bakersfield, citizens gathered outside police headquarters in numbers that grew by the hour. Many carried signs with Eleanor's image and the words, "If they'll do this to a Supreme Court justice, what will they do to me?" Mayor Jackson, whose political instincts had always been sharp, recognized the changing winds. He called an emergency press conference, standing alone at the podium, rather than flanked by police leadership as in previous appearances. The footage released yesterday shows conduct that is completely unacceptable and contrary to the values of our community, he read from a prepared statement. "I'm calling for an independent investigation into the arrest of Justice Washington and the subsequent handling of evidence." Eleanor watched the press conference from her safe house, noting the careful language. "He's distancing himself from the department," she observed to Michael, who had been released from the hospital but still moved gingerly due to his injuries, setting them up as scapegoats. Within days, a citizen group announced a recall petition against Mayor Jackson, having gathered 3 times the required signatures. The political firewall that had protected the corrupt system for decades was beginning to crumble. State Attorney General Diane Lawson seized the momentum, announcing a criminal investigation into the Randall County Police Department. The evidence suggests potential crimes including obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, witness intimidation, and civil rights violations, she declared at her own press conference. No one is above the law, especially those sworn to uphold it. The FBI, meanwhile, escalated their involvement. Agents executed search warrants at the police department headquarters and Mayor Jackson's office simultaneously. The raids yielded a trove of incriminating documents that department leadership had failed to destroy. Captain Russell, apparently tipped off about the impending raid, attempted to delete files from his computer when agents entered his office. This real-time obstruction resulted in his immediate arrest on federal charges. Officer Miller, seeing former allies abandoning him, attempted to flee the jurisdiction. Border Patrol agents apprehended him at the Mexican border, where he had dyed his distinctive blonde hair black and was traveling under a false name. As these developments unfolded, Eleanor received unprecedented support from her Supreme Court colleagues. All 8 other justices signed a joint statement condemning the treatment she had received and the subsequent intimidation campaign. The attempt to silence a member of this court through violence, threats, and character assassination represents an assault on judicial independence and the rule of law itself, the statement read. "We stand unequivocally with Justice Washington in her pursuit of accountability." The department's insurance company delivered another blow, informing county officials that it would not cover punitive damages resulting from willful misconduct and civil rights violations. The county faced financial liability that could potentially bankrupt it. City council members, seeing the writing on the wall, began publicly distancing themselves from the mayor and police leadership. "I had no knowledge of these practices," became the common refrain, though evidence increasingly suggested otherwise. The grand jury convened by the state attorney general began hearing testimony from current and former police officers, city officials, and victims of the department's discriminatory practices. Several officers, facing potential charges themselves, offered to testify against leadership in exchange for immunity. Among them was Sergeant James Peterson, who had been with the department for 23 years. His testimony revealed the systematic targeting of black citizens had been official but unwritten policy for decades. "We were instructed to maintain high arrest numbers in certain neighborhoods," Peterson testified. The explicit goal was to keep pressure on troublemakers, but everyone understood who that referred to. Officers who questioned these directives were assigned to undesirable shifts or passed over for promotion. Mayor Jackson, watching his political career implode, attempted a final, desperate maneuver. He reached out to state officials, offering to implicate Captain Russell and other police leadership in exchange for immunity from prosecution. "The mayor is throwing everyone under the bus to save himself," Michael remarked when news of the offer leaked. "Typical," Eleanor replied. "The powerful always believe they can bargain their way out of consequences." The Attorney General declined Jackson's offer, having already accumulated sufficient evidence against all parties involved. Eleanor's personal vindication came when Marcus Thompson, the missing witness, was found alive. He had fled after being assaulted by two officers who had warned him that accidents happen to people who talk too much. Terrified, he had driven to his cousin's home in Nevada without telling anyone. Now safely in FBI custody, Thompson provided crucial testimony about the department's quota system and financial incentives for targeting minority neighborhoods. The most damning evidence emerged when investigators discovered encrypted communications between Mayor Jackson, Captain Russell, and Judge Harrison dating back years. The messages detailed their coordinated efforts to protect officers accused of misconduct, particularly against black citizens. "Make sure this complaint gets assigned to me," read one message from Harrison to Jackson regarding a brutality case. "I'll handle it like the others." Another exchange discussed the asset forfeiture program explicitly as a revenue generation scheme. "These seizures fund everything from overtime to the mayor's community initiatives," Russell had written. "We need to keep the numbers up." With each new revelation, public outrage intensified. Civil rights organizations called for federal oversight of the department. Legal scholars discussed the case as potentially landmark in setting new standards for police accountability. For Eleanor, watching from her secure location as the corrupt system unraveled, the vindication was bittersweet. The justice she had sought was materializing, but at enormous personal cost. Her health had suffered from the stress and trauma. Her sense of security, once taken for granted, had been permanently altered. "Was it worth it?" Michael asked her. One evening, as they reviewed the latest developments, Eleanor considered the question carefully. "Ask the hundreds of people who suffered what I suffered, without the platform or resources to fight back. Ask the young man I saw beaten in that cell for asking about his rights. Ask Marcus Thompson, who risked his life to expose the truth." She paused. Yes, it was worth it, but the fight isn't over. Indeed, even as the criminal investigations progressed, Eleanor knew the most consequential battle still lay ahead. The department had filed an appeal of the settlement on technical grounds, arguing that the evidence of systematic discrimination had been improperly admitted. The appeal had been fast-tracked due to the high-profile nature of the case, and oral arguments were scheduled before the Federal Court of Appeals. The department's strategy was clear: delay implementation of reforms while attempting to overturn the settlement entirely. Eleanor and Michael worked tirelessly with their legal team to prepare for the appeal, knowing that the structural changes they had fought for hung in the balance. The criminal prosecutions might punish individuals, but only upholding the settlement would transform the system itself. As the appeal date approached, Eleanor received unexpected news. The Supreme Court had certified a related police misconduct case for review. The timing meant that if the Randall County case reached the Supreme Court on appeal, Eleanor would face an unprecedented situation, recusing herself from a case that directly involved her own experience. "They're banking on the court being more conservative on police immunity without your vote," Michael observed. Eleanor nodded gravely. "And they might be right, but they've underestimated my colleague's commitment to constitutional principles." The tables had turned dramatically. The department that had once humiliated Eleanor now faced criminal charges, public condemnation, and financial ruin. The officials who had protected the corrupt system now turned on each other in a desperate bid to save themselves. And Eleanor Washington, who had been dismissed as a crazy old lady in that holding cell, now stood at the center of a national reckoning on police accountability. As she prepared for the next phase of the legal battle, Eleanor received word that Officer Rodriguez, who had sacrificed his career to expose the department's cover-up, had been contacted by police academies across the country. They wanted him to speak about ethical policing and the courage to stand against corruption. Sometimes, Eleanor told Michael, justice comes in unexpected ways. The federal district courthouse in Sacramento was surrounded by barricades, the street filled with demonstrators holding signs supporting either Eleanor Washington or the police department. The class action lawsuit against Randall County Police Department had become more than a legal case. It had evolved into a national referendum on police accountability and racial justice. Inside the packed courtroom, Eleanor sat with perfect posture at the plaintiff's table, her judicial experience allowing her to maintain a serene exterior despite the stakes. Michael sat beside her, still wearing a neck brace from his accident. Their legal team, now expanded to include attorneys from the National Civil Rights Legal Defense Fund and several prestigious law firms working pro bono, occupied additional tables. The defense tables were equally crowded with attorneys representing the police department, Mayor Jackson, Judge Harrison, and the private prison company. The defendants themselves were notably absent, except for Officer Miller, who was required to appear as a named party. Judge Rodriguez called the court to order, his gavel silencing the murmurs of the gallery. National media occupied the back rows, sketch artists capturing the scene since cameras weren't permitted. This trial will address serious allegations of systematic civil rights violations, Rodriguez began. I remind everyone that these proceedings will be conducted with the decorum this court demands. The trial began with Eleanor's testimony. For 3 hours, she recounted her experience with precise detail. The unwarranted traffic stop, Officer Miller's escalating aggression, the baton strike that left her bloodied, and the subsequent humiliation at the police station. Despite identifying myself as a federal judge, I was mocked, denied medical care, and treated with contempt, she testified, her voice steady. My judicial status ultimately resulted in my release, but throughout my detention I observed other people of color receiving similar or worse treatment without the benefit of my position to protect them. Eleanor's testimony set the stage for a parade of witnesses who shared strikingly similar experiences, spanning decades. A 70-year-old retired teacher described being dragged from his car during a routine traffic stop. A 35-year-old business owner testified about having his cash seized during a stop without ever being charged with a crime. A 19-year-old college student recounted being held at gunpoint when he reached for his registration as instructed. Each story built upon the last, creating a devastating portrait of systematic abuses specifically targeting black citizens. The defense attorneys objected repeatedly, arguing that these incidents were isolated and unrelated. But Judge Rodriguez allowed the testimony to continue, finding it relevant to establishing pattern and practice. Expert witnesses provided statistical analysis demonstrating racial disparities in traffic stops, searches, arrests, and use of force incidents in Randall County. Dr. James Morrison, a criminologist, testified that black drivers in the county were 7 times more likely to be stopped than white drivers, and 12 times more likely to be searched once stopped, despite contraband being found less frequently. These disparities cannot be explained by any factor other than race, Dr. Morrison concluded. The statistical pattern shows clear targeting of black citizens across all measurable metrics of police activity. The most damaging testimony came from within the department itself. Several officers granted immunity by the state attorney general testified about the quota systems, targeting directives and explicit instructions to focus enforcement efforts in predominantly black neighborhoods. Officer Rodriguez described the department's cover-up efforts in detail, playing his recording of Captain Russell, instructing officers to delete evidence and coordinate their stories about Eleanor's arrest. Throughout the proceedings, the defense strategy shifted from denial to deflection. Unable to dispute the growing mountain of evidence, they attempted to portray the documented abuses as the actions of a few bad apples rather than systematic policy. When Officer Miller took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. Gone was the arrogant swagger from the day of Eleanor's arrest. He appeared nervous, his eyes darting around the courtroom, avoiding Eleanor's steady gaze. Under cross-examination by Eleanor's attorneys, Miller's testimony began to unravel. He initially maintained that he had followed proper procedure during Eleanor's arrest, but when confronted with the recovered body camera footage, he stumbled. It doesn't show the full context, he insisted, as the footage clearly showed him striking an unarmed, non-threatening elderly woman with his baton. What context would justify striking a 78-year-old woman who was not resisting? The attorney pressed. Miller had no answer. As questioning continued, his defiance crumbled. When asked about departmental targeting policies, he broke down. "We were told certain neighborhoods needed extra attention," he admitted. The message was clear about which neighborhoods those were. Mayor Jackson's testimony proved equally devastating to the defense. Attempting to save himself, he pleaded the Fifth Amendment to most questions, creating a damning impression for the jury. When asked directly about his relationship with Officer Miller, Jackson refused to answer. When questioned about communications with Judge Harrison regarding police misconduct cases, he again invoked his constitutional protection against self-incrimination. After 3 weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury. They deliberated for just 3 hours before returning with their verdict, an almost unprecedented short time for such a complex case. "We find in favor of the plaintiffs on all counts," the jury forewoman announced. The jury awarded $18 million in compensatory damages to the class members and an extraordinary $157 million in punitive damages against the department, the mayor's office, and the private prison company. Beyond the financial award, the verdict triggered the automatic implementation of all structural reforms stipulated in the settlement agreement. Independent prosecution of police misconduct cases, elimination of the quota system, dissolution of the asset forfeiture program, termination of the contract with Clearwater Corrections, and establishment of a civilian oversight board with real enforcement power. Judge Rodriguez took the unprecedented step of ordering federal oversight of the department for a minimum of 5 years. The evidence presented demonstrates a clear pattern of constitutional violations so pervasive and long-standing that external supervision is necessary to ensure compliance with basic civil rights protections, he stated in his ruling. The courtroom erupted in subdued reactions, tears from class members, stunned silence from defense attorneys, and quiet nods of vindication from Eleanor and her team. Outside the courthouse, Eleanor addressed the gathered media and supporters. "Today's verdict is not about victory for me personally, but about accountability for a system that has operated with impunity for generations. This case was never about one traffic stop or one officer's misconduct. It was about dismantling a structure of oppression that has terrorized communities of color in this county for decades." As Eleanor spoke, her legal team received notice that the department had already filed an appeal to the circuit court, challenging the verdict on technical grounds. The fight wasn't over. The most surprising development came days later when evidence emerged of similar patterns of abuse in 3 neighboring counties. Investigations revealed connections between departments, suggesting the discriminatory practices extended beyond Randall County's borders. Criminal indictments followed the civil verdict. Captain Russell, Mayor Jackson, Judge Harrison, and several other officials faced federal charges including conspiracy against rights, obstruction of justice, and racketeering. Officer Miller accepted a plea deal, agreeing to testify against department leadership in exchange for a reduced sentence. Eleanor had won the most significant legal victory of her distinguished career, not from the bench, but as a plaintiff, seeking justice. Yet even as she celebrated this apparent triumph, she received word that the U.S. Supreme Court had agreed to hear the department's appeal on an expedited basis. The highest court in the land would now determine whether the landmark reforms would stand, and Eleanor Washington, Associate Justice of that very court, would be forced to recuse herself from a case that could determine whether what happened to her would continue happening to others. The final battle would take place in the very institution to which she had dedicated her life, but without her voice to influence the outcome. The Supreme Court chambers felt both familiar and strange to Eleanor Washington as she took her seat in the gallery rather than on the bench. For the first time in her judicial career, she would be observing a case as an interested party rather than deciding it. The court had agreed to hear Randall County versus Washington on an expedited basis, recognizing its national significance. The department's appeal hinged on technical arguments about class certification and the scope of the remedies ordered by the lower court. Eleanor's recusal had been automatic and necessary. No justice could rule on a case in which they were personally involved, but her absence from the bench created a potential 4-4 split on a court often divided along ideological lines when it came to police powers. "How does it feel to be on this side?" Michael whispered as they waited for the justices to enter. "Humbling," Eleanor replied, "and terrifying." As her 8 colleagues filed in and took their seats, Eleanor felt a profound shift in perspective. She had spent years in that elevated position. Now she would be subject to their judgment. Everything she had fought for over the past months hung on their decision. The oral arguments proceeded with the technical precision typical of Supreme Court proceedings. The department's attorneys argued that the class certification had been overbroad, the financial penalties excessive, and the required reforms beyond the court's authority to mandate. The district court effectively took control of local law enforcement from democratically elected officials, the department's counsel argued. This represents a dangerous overreach of judicial authority into executive functions. Eleanor's legal team countered that the systemic nature of the violations required equally systemic remedies. When constitutional violations are woven into the fabric of an institution, piecemeal solutions are insufficient, her attorney argued. The district court's remedies are narrowly tailored to address specific documented abuses. As she listened to the arguments, Eleanor studied her colleagues' expressions and questions, trying to gauge their leanings. The conservative justices seemed concerned about judicial overreach, while the liberal wing focused on the overwhelming evidence of constitutional violations. Chief Justice Parker, who had privately supported Eleanor throughout her ordeal, asked pointed questions of both sides. As the swing vote, his position would likely determine the outcome. "If we accept the pattern of violations as established by the lower court," Parker asked the department's attorney, "what remedy would you suggest that could adequately address systematic discrimination of this magnitude?" The attorney struggled to provide a substantive answer, falling back on suggestions for enhanced training and internal review processes, the very mechanisms that had failed for decades. When the arguments concluded, Eleanor left the courthouse, surrounded by supporters, but feeling profoundly uncertain. The next 7 weeks of waiting proved to be among the most difficult of her life. The entire country seemed to hold its breath with her, recognizing that the court's decision would set precedent for police accountability cases nationwide. On a crisp morning in March, the court issued its ruling, a stunning 7-1 decision largely upholding the lower court's verdict and remedies. Chief Justice Parker, writing for the majority, referenced the overwhelming and uncontested evidence of systematic constitutional violations targeting citizens on the basis of race. When local institutions demonstrate such profound and pervasive failure to protect constitutional rights, Parker wrote, federal courts not only have the authority but the obligation to impose remedies sufficient to address those violations. The lone dissent focused narrowly on the scope of remedies rather than disputing the underlying findings, arguing that certain structural reforms exceeded judicial authority. The decision was immediately hailed as a landmark ruling that would strengthen civil rights protections nationwide. Legal scholars noted that the court had established a new, more robust standard for addressing systematic police misconduct. For Eleanor, the victory was both professional and deeply personal. The reforms she had fought for would now be implemented not just in Randall County, but would serve as a template for addressing similar abuses across the country. The department underwent a complete restructuring under federal oversight. The quota system was dismantled. The asset forfeiture program was reformed to require criminal convictions before property could be permanently seized. The contract with Clearwater Corrections was terminated, with county detention returning to public management. Most significantly, a powerful civilian oversight board was established with real authority to investigate misconduct, discipline officers, and recommend criminal charges when appropriate. The board's membership reflected the diversity of the community it served. Eleanor established the Washington Justice Initiative, a foundation providing legal assistance to victims of police misconduct who lacked resources to fight back. Funded by her portion of the settlement, the foundation quickly expanded its work to multiple states. Officer Miller served 18 months in federal prison for civil rights violations. Upon his release, he made an unexpected choice. He began speaking at police academies about his experience, using his story as a cautionary tale about the corrupting influence of systemic racism in policing. After one such presentation, he requested a meeting with Eleanor. Despite initial hesitation, she agreed to see him. Their meeting was brief but profound. Miller apologized directly for his actions and for the subsequent harassment campaign. "I was part of a system that taught me to see certain people as less deserving of dignity and respect," he acknowledged. "It's no excuse, but I'm trying to make sure other officers don't follow the same path." Eleanor's response was measured. "True justice isn't about punishment but transformation. What matters now is what you do with the understanding you've gained." The most far-reaching impact came through Eleanor's return to the Supreme Court. Having experienced the justice system from both sides, she brought a transformed perspective to her jurisprudence. In the years that followed, she authored majority opinions strengthening protections against unreasonable searches and seizures, limiting qualified immunity for officers who violated clearly established rights, and enhancing accountability for pattern or practice violations. Law schools across the country incorporated Washington v. Randall County Police Department into their required curriculum. The case became a cornerstone of civil rights education, teaching future generations of attorneys and judges about the importance of systemic remedies for systemic problems. 5 years after the ordeal began, Eleanor visited Bakersfield to observe the changes firsthand. The police department, now under new leadership, had become a model for community-oriented policing. Traffic stop data showed no significant racial disparities. Citizen complaints had declined by 78%. During her visit, Eleanor witnessed something that moved her deeply. An elderly black woman was pulled over for a minor traffic violation. The officer approached respectfully, explained the reason for the stop, and treated her with dignity throughout the interaction. No assumptions were made, no threats were issued. Basic courtesy was extended. It was a small moment, but it represented exactly what Eleanor had fought for: the right of every citizen to be treated with equal respect under the law, regardless of race or age. As Eleanor's visit concluded, she made a final stop at Oakwood Cemetery. Standing before Thomas's grave, she placed fresh roses as she had done on the day of her fateful traffic stop. "We finally moved the needle, Thomas," she said softly. "Not as far as it needs to go, but it moved." The Washington case didn't end. Racism or police misconduct in America, no single case could achieve that. But it created meaningful accountability, established powerful legal precedents, and demonstrated that systemic problems required systemic solutions. For Eleanor Washington, the personal cost had been enormous. Her health, security, and peace of mind had all been sacrificed in the fight. Yet when asked years later whether she would do it all again, her answer never wavered. "Justice isn't just a concept to be admired from a distance," she would say. "Sometimes it must be fought for inch by painful inch. Sometimes it requires placing yourself in harm's way, but always, always it is worth the fight." The elderly woman, who had been pulled over by a racist cop, had transformed an act of discrimination into a movement for justice that would protect generations to come. In doing so, Eleanor Washington had written her most important legal opinion, not from the bench, but from the crucible of personal experience, an opinion that would shape American justice for decades to follow. Eleanor Washington's extraordinary journey teaches us that justice requires more than legal principles. It demands courage and personal sacrifice. When systems of oppression become entrenched, they don't yield easily to challenge, often responding with escalating retaliation against those who expose them. True change comes not from accepting isolated reforms, but from dismantling the entire architecture of injustice. The case reminds us that racism isn't just about individual acts of prejudice, but about systematic structures that enable and protect those acts. Justice Washington could have accepted a quiet settlement for herself, but chose instead to fight for everyone without her platform and privilege. Her story demonstrates that authority unchecked by accountability inevitably becomes corrupted, regardless of who wields it. The most profound lesson may be that no one is immune to injustice in a system built on discrimination, but likewise, no one is powerless to challenge it. By refusing to be silenced, one determined individual can create ripples of transformation that extend far beyond their personal experience, ultimately bending the long arc of history toward justice. What systems of injustice exist in your community that need someone brave enough to challenge them? Have you ever witnessed discrimination and stayed silent, or found the courage to speak up? Comment below with your experiences or thoughts on how Eleanor's fight resonates with issues we still face today. If you believe in the power of one person to create lasting change, hit that like button to stand with Justice Washington. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that illuminate the ongoing struggle for equality and justice in America. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that fighting for what's right is always worth it, no matter the cost. Thank you for joining us on this journey through Eleanor Washington's remarkable story. May we all find a fraction of her courage when faced with the choice between comfortable silence and necessary action.